The storm battered against the windows, the old house groaning under the weight of the wind. Rain streaked down the glass in jagged trails, each droplet catching the dim glow of the street lamp outside. Inside, Henry sat in the darkened living room, the only light a flickering candle on the coffee table. The power had gone out hours ago, plunging the house into an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional crack of thunder. He hadn't intended to stay up late, but sleep had been elusive ever since Eliza's passing. Her absence clung to the house, filling every room with a hollow emptiness. Tonight, though, felt different. There was something almost alive about the silence, as though the house itself were listening, waiting. Henry's gaze drifted upward, toward the attic door recessed in the ceiling above the hallway. He'd barely thought about the attic since Eliza's death. They'd never stored much up there, and she'd always insisted it was a drafty, unwelcoming place. But tonight, a strange impulse tugged at him, a pull he couldn't quite explain. When the sound came, a faint creak, like footsteps overhead, he froze. It could have been the wind shifting the beams, but it didn't sound like the usual groans of the old house. It was rhythmic, deliberate. His chest tightened as he stared at the attic door, the pull growing stronger with each passing second. Grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, Henry forced himself to the hallway. He stood beneath the attic door, his heart hammering as the beam of light revealed the pull cord hanging like a noose. He hesitated, almost retreating to the safety of the living room, but something deep inside him whispered that this moment mattered, that he couldn't turn back now. With a trembling hand, he tugged the cord. The door swung open, the wooden ladder unfolding with a loud groan that echoed through the house. The air that spilled down from the attic was cold, tinged with the scent of dust and something faintly metallic. The flashlight's beam trembled as Henry climbed the ladder, his breath shallow. The attic was larger than he remembered, its corners swallowed by darkness. Boxes and trunks were scattered across the floor, shrouded in cobwebs. The storm outside seemed distant now, as though the attic existed in its own world of muffled silence. He swept the light across the space and stopped. Against the far wall stood a small, battered chest, its surface scarred with scratches and stains. It wasn't theirs. He was sure of it. He would have remembered something so out of place, so wrong. The chest seemed to call to him, its presence oppressive. As he approached, the metallic scent grew stronger, stinging his nostrils. The lock was rusted but loose, and with a sharp twist, it broke apart. Inside were neatly folded letters tied with a red ribbon, and a small, intricately designed locket resting on top. Henry's fingers hovered over the locket, the ornate patterns carved into its surface, unlike anything he'd seen before. Strange symbols, curved and angular, were etched around its edges, surrounding a tiny latch. When he opened it, he expected a photo, or perhaps a lock of hair. But the interior was empty, save for faint scratches, as though something had once been inside, but was now missing. It wasn't until he unfolded the first letter that he felt the room shift. The air thickened, the silence deepened, and the hairs on the back of his neck rose. Written in Eliza's elegant hand, the words were cryptic, almost desperate. "The sea whispers, Henry. If you hear them, don't listen. Please stay away from the light." Henry couldn't stop thinking about the locket or the letters. By the next morning, the storm had passed, but his mind remained clouded. He sat at the kitchen table, turning the locket over in his hands. The strange symbols seemed to writhe under his gaze, as though alive. One letter, dated 2 weeks before Eliza's death, mentioned a name, Ellis Grendel. He was a clockmaker in a neighboring town, known for restoring antique timepieces. The name felt oddly familiar, though Henry couldn't place why. By midday, he was on the road, the locket tucked into his jacket pocket. The drive to Grendel's workshop took him through winding coastal roads, the cliffs to his right dropping sharply into the roiling sea below. The waves crashed against the rocks, their rhythmic pounding eerily reminiscent of the ticking of a clock. The shop was tucked into a quiet street, its exterior unremarkable save for a sign painted with an elaborate clock face. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of varnish and oil. Clocks of every shape and size lined the walls, their steady ticking creating a cacophony that set Henry's nerves on edge. Behind the counter stood a thin, wiry man with piercing eyes and delicate hands that seemed to belong to someone much younger. He was polishing the face of a grandfather clock, but he set the cloth aside as Henry approached. "I need to ask you about something," Henry said, placing the locket on the counter. Grendel's face darkened the moment he saw it. His hands trembled as he reached out, though he didn't touch the locket. Instead, he leaned closer, his breath shallow. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It belonged to my wife," Henry replied. "Do you know what it is?" Grendel straightened, his expression unreadable. "This locket is tied to something old. Dangerous. People who own it don't tend to live long, Mr. Warren." Henry's stomach churned. "You mean it's cursed?" "Not cursed. Bound," Grendel said, his eyes narrowing. "The symbols on the locket are wards. Without them, the whispers would consume whoever carries it. Your wife must have heard them." "What whispers?" Grendel hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near growl. "Go to the lighthouse, Mr. Warren. That's where it begins, and that's where you'll find the truth about your wife's secrets." The lighthouse loomed on the cliff's edge like a sentinel, its weathered stone facade streaked with salt and age. Henry parked his car at the base of the hill and began the ascent, the air thick with the tang of the ocean. The path was steep, overgrown with wild grass and brambles, and each step seemed heavier than the last. Above, storm clouds gathered, blotting out the sun and casting the world in a bruised shade of gray. The wind carried faint whispers, teasing the edges of Henry's hearing, but when he stopped to listen, there was only the crashing of waves far below. The lighthouse was abandoned, its once proud beacon now dark and lifeless. A rusted metal door barred the entrance, its surface crusted with layers of peeling paint and barnacles. Henry pushed against it, and with a groan, the door gave way. Inside, the air was damp and stagnant, carrying the scent of mildew and decay. The narrow spiral staircase wound upward, its steps uneven and slick. As Henry climbed, the whispers returned, louder now, weaving in and out of the creaks and groans of the old structure. He reached the top and stepped into the lantern room, where glass panes, cracked and stained by years of neglect, offered a distorted view of the sea. The lens was shattered, its brass fittings tarnished, but it wasn't the destruction that caught Henry's attention. A journal lay on a small wooden table, its leather cover warped with age. Henry opened it with trembling hands, the pages brittle and ink smudged. The handwriting was cramped and uneven, as though written in haste. The entries were from a man named Joseph Grant, the lighthouse keeper. They began innocuously enough, descriptions of the weather, maintenance notes, and the occasional anecdote about ships passing in the night. But as Henry read further, the tone shifted. August 3rd, the whispers began today. At first, I thought it was the wind through the cracks, but no, they're words. I can't make them out, but they're there. August 10th. The light behaved strangely tonight. It flickered on its own, casting shadows that moved against the walls. I heard my name whispered in the wind. Am I going mad? August 17th. I saw her tonight, a woman standing on the rocks below, her hair streaming in the wind. She was holding something, a locket. I called out to her, but she didn't answer. When I went down, she was gone. Only her footprints remained in the sand. Henry's pulse quickened as he turned the pages, his breath catching at the final entry. August 25th. She came again. She said her name was Eliza. The journal slipped from Henry's hands, the sound of its fall swallowed by the oppressive silence. His mind raced, connecting fragments of what he'd uncovered. Eliza had been here, drawn to the whispers, to something tied to this place. As if in response to his thoughts, a faint melody drifted through the room. It was hauntingly beautiful, like a lullaby sung in a language he couldn't understand. The locket in his pocket grew warm, pulsing faintly against his chest. Henry turned toward the window and froze. The fog had thickened, swirling in unnatural patterns. Shapes moved within it, tall, shadowy figures that flickered in and out of view. They surrounded the lighthouse, their forms indistinct yet unmistakably human. Then, from the base of the tower, a voice called out, low and resonant. "Henry!" Henry stumbled back from the window, his heart pounding. The voice from below was too familiar, Eliza's. But that was impossible. She was gone. The melody grew louder, intertwining with the whispers that filled the room. It wasn't just sound. It was a presence, wrapping around him, pressing against his mind. The locket pulsed faster, almost as if it were alive. "Henry!" The voice called again, softer now, almost pleading. Clutching the locket, Henry descended the staircase, each step a struggle, as the air seemed to thicken around him. By the time he reached the base of the lighthouse, the fog had crept inside, coiling around his legs like living smoke. The door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Beyond it, the fog parted, revealing a figure standing at the edge of the cliff. "Eliza?" Henry's voice cracked as he stepped closer. The figure turned, and for a moment, it was her. Her dark hair, her soft smile, the way her eyes seemed to hold the weight of the world. But as he blinked, her image shimmered and fractured, revealing something else beneath. It was still her face, but hollow, pale, and wrong. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her mouth moved without sound before the whispers filled the void again. "Why?" Henry choked, tears streaming down his face. "Why didn't you tell me?" The figure extended a hand, the locket's symbols glowing faintly as if in answer. The warmth in Henry's pocket grew unbearable, and he pulled it out, holding it between them. The whispers surged, rising to a crescendo, and suddenly Henry understood. The locket wasn't a charm. It was a key. It had been Eliza's shield, her tether to this world as she tried to escape the pull of the whispers. But in passing it to him, she had inadvertently passed on her burden. "Eliza," he whispered, his voice breaking. Her lips moved again, this time forming words he could hear. "Destroy it." The fog thickened, swallowing her form, and Henry was left alone at the edge of the cliff, the locket burning in his hand. Above, the lighthouse's shattered beacon flared to life, casting its light out over the sea. And in that light, the shadows moved closer. The light from the lighthouse burned unnaturally bright, cutting through the dense fog and casting long, distorted shadows over the jagged cliffs. Henry stood frozen, the locket searing against his palm as the whispers surrounded him, their cadence rising like a fevered chant. The figures in the fog drew closer, their forms shifting with each step. They were neither fully solid nor entirely incorporeal, their outlines wavering like heat mirages. What little Henry could see of their faces was deeply unsettling, features that seemed familiar yet alien, as though they were fractured reflections of people long lost to time. "Eliza," he called out, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. The fog churned violently, a vortex of swirling gray and silver that swallowed the horizon. The melody returned, softer now but more insistent, threading through the whispers like a hypnotic refrain. The locket throbbed in time with the song, and Henry felt its pull, an almost magnetic force urging him toward the edge of the cliff. "No!" he shouted, taking a step back. He clutched the locket tighter, the intricate symbols glowing faintly in response. He could feel the weight of it, the significance of its purpose, though its exact nature remained maddeningly elusive. The shadows paused, their forms flickering as if caught in hesitation. The whispers softened, morphing into words Henry could almost understand. "Let go." Henry shook his head, his pulse pounding in his ears. "What do you want from me?" The lighthouse answered, its beam sweeping across the sea in a rhythmic, unnatural pattern. For a moment the fog parted, revealing the roiling water below. The waves churned, their movements unnatural and deliberate, forming shapes that seemed to claw at the rocky shore. The figures stepped forward as one, their collective presence a suffocating force that pressed against Henry's chest. He staggered, gasping for breath as the locket's heat intensified, its symbols now glowing like molten gold. "Eliza said to destroy it," he whispered to himself, his fingers trembling as he raised the locket to eye level. The whispers surged in response, an indiscernible roar that clawed at his mind. Shadows stretched toward him, their edges sharp and jagged, the figures desperate to reach the locket. But as Henry stared at the glowing object, something within him shifted. A memory surfaced, Eliza's laughter on a quiet summer evening, her hand slipping into his as they strolled along the beach. She had been so full of life, so grounded, yet he now realized how much she must have hidden from him. The melody swelled, and for a moment, Henry thought he saw her face in the light of the lighthouse. It wasn't the hollow, spectral version he'd seen before, but her, whole, human. She mouthed one final word, her voice carried faintly on the wind. "Choose." The locket grew heavier, the whispers turning pleading, almost frantic. Henry closed his eyes, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. If he destroyed the locket, would it end the whispers, or would it unleash something far worse, something he couldn't begin to comprehend? The sea roared beneath him, and the lighthouse's beam faltered, its light flickering as if sensing his hesitation. The fog thickened, the figures closing the final distance between them. Taking a deep breath, Henry whispered, "I'm sorry, Eliza." With trembling hands, he threw the locket into the sea. For a moment, everything stopped. The whispers fell silent, the shadows froze, and the fog seemed to hold its breath. The world teetered on the edge of something vast and unknowable, and Henry felt as though he were standing at the threshold of eternity. Then, with a deafening roar, the sea surged upward, a column of water and light that swallowed the locket whole. The lighthouse's beam exploded into brilliance, illuminating the night in a blinding cascade of gold and silver. The figures in the fog dissolved, their forms unraveling like smoke in the wind. Henry staggered back, shielding his eyes as the light consumed everything around him. The whispers faded, replaced by a deep, resonant silence that pressed against his ears. When he opened his eyes, the fog was gone, the sea calm and endless beneath a starless sky. The lighthouse stood dark and lifeless once more, its glass shattered and broken as though the light had never been. Henry sank to his knees, the weight of exhaustion and grief crushing him. The locket was gone, and with it, the whispers. But the air still felt heavy, as though the cost of his choice lingered, unseen and unresolved. From the corner of his eye, he thought he saw a figure standing on the distant shore. A woman with dark hair, her outline blurred by the faint glow of the waves. But when he blinked, she was gone. Henry rose unsteadily and began the descent from the cliff. Behind him, the lighthouse remained silent, its purpose fulfilled, or its burden shifted. As he reached his car and turned the ignition, he glanced one last time at the sea. The waves lapped gently against the rocks, their rhythm strangely familiar, almost like the ticking of a clock. And deep within the silence, he thought he heard the faintest whisper of a melody, carried on the wind.